The smell of disinfectant and stale air hit me like a slap across the face as I watched my daughter's car disappear down the parking lot. Her taillights grew smaller and smaller until they were just red dots in the distance, and then, nothing. Just me, standing there with a single suitcase in my weathered hands, watching the only family I had left drive away without so much as a backwards glance. I remember thinking, this can't be real. This can't be how it ends. 78 years of life, 54 years of marriage, 3 children I'd raised with every ounce of love in my body. And it all came down to this moment. Standing in front of Willowbrook Nursing Home, abandoned like a piece of furniture that no longer fit the decor. The automatic doors opened with a mechanical whoosh, swallowing me whole. This story is already stirring something in your heart. I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now, and which city or state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this story is reaching. My name is Eleanor, though everyone used to call me Ellie. Used to. Past tense. Funny how quickly you become past tense when you're no longer convenient. I've lived in the same small town in Ohio for most of my life, in a house that held more memories than its old wooden frame could bear. A house where I'd raised my children, buried my husband, and somehow convinced myself that family meant something more than obligation. I used to wake up every morning to the sound of birds outside my bedroom window, the same window where I'd watched my children take their first steps in the backyard, where I'd waved goodbye to my husband as he left for work every day for 30 years, where I'd prayed during the long nights when he was fighting cancer. That window was my portal to a world that felt safe, familiar, mine. But that morning, 3 months before everything fell apart, I woke up to silence. No birds. No familiar creaking of the house settling into another day. Just the hollow echo of my own breathing in a space that suddenly felt too big, too empty, too full of ghosts. I should have known then that something was shifting, that the foundation I'd built my life on was already beginning to crack. I should have seen it coming, I told myself later, over and over until the words lost all meaning. But how do you prepare for the moment when your own children look at you and see nothing but a burden? How do you brace yourself for the discovery that love, the kind you thought was unconditional, actually comes with an expiration date? The truth is, I was already disappearing long before they drove away. Disappearing into the background of their busy lives. Becoming invisible in the very home where I'd been the center of everything for so long. Age has a way of making you translucent, like old glass that people can see right through without really noticing what's on the other side. My story really begins with Richard. My Richard. We met at a church social when I was just 19, him 22, both of us awkward and hopeful in that way young people are when they think love is simple and life is predictable. He had the kindest eyes I'd ever seen, brown like rich coffee, and when he smiled, really smiled, it was like the sun coming out after rain. We married 2 years later in the same church where we met. I can still remember my wedding dress, cream-colored silk that my mother had sewn by hand, with tiny pearl buttons that took forever to fasten. Richard's hands shook when he slipped the ring onto my finger, and I thought it was the most romantic thing in the world. Nervous because he loves me so much, I thought. Nervous because this matters. We moved into a little house on Maple Street. Nothing fancy, just 2 bedrooms and a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people, but it was ours. Richard worked at the factory, steady work that paid enough for us to dream about the future. We painted the walls yellow because I read somewhere that yellow meant happiness, and we wanted to start our marriage surrounded by joy. Sarah came first 3 years into our marriage. Healthy and perfect, with Richard's brown eyes and my stubborn chin. I remember holding her for the first time and feeling like my heart had grown too big for my chest. This tiny human who depended on me completely, who looked at me like I was the entire world. I'd never felt so important, so needed, so absolutely essential to someone else's existence. Then came Michael 2 years later, followed by Jennifer when Sarah was 7. Our little house on Maple Street suddenly felt like the center of the universe. Breakfast every morning around our small kitchen table, bedtime stories that I'd make up on the spot, scraped knees that only mama's kisses could heal. Richard would come home from work tired but smiling, ready to listen to stories about spelling tests and playground dramas and all the small miracles that make up a child's day. Those were the golden years, though I didn't know it then. I thought that was just life. That feeling of being the heart of something bigger than yourself, of knowing that you mattered in the most fundamental way possible. I thought it would last forever. Richard was a good father, the kind who got down on the floor to play with toy cars and never minded when the children interrupted his newspaper to show him a drawing or ask for help with homework. He taught Michael how to throw a baseball in our tiny backyard, helped Sarah build doll houses from cardboard boxes, and convinced Jennifer that she could be anything she wanted to be when she grew up, even an astronaut or a dinosaur hunter. But more than that, he was my partner in the deepest sense. We'd lie in bed at night after the children were asleep, whispering about our dreams for them, planning family vacations we couldn't quite afford, making promises about the kind of life we wanted to build together. He held me when I cried over miscarriages that came after Jennifer, and I held him when his father died too young. We were a team facing the world together, making decisions as one unit. I used to joke that I was the heart of our family and Richard was the backbone. I was the one who kissed boo-boos and remembered birthdays and made sure everyone felt loved. He was the one who provided stability, who worked extra hours to pay for piano lessons and school clothes, who carried the weight of responsibility without complaint. Together we created something beautiful. The children grew up surrounded by that love. Sarah was the responsible one, the little mother who helped me with her younger siblings and always had a plan for everything. Michael was our athlete, throwing himself into every sport with enthusiasm and determination. Jennifer was our artist, always creating something with her hands. Clay sculptures, painted rocks, stories written in careful cursive on lined paper. They were good children. Not perfect, they fought and sulked and sometimes broke my favorite dishes while helping in the kitchen. But good. They said please and thank you without being reminded. They called me every Mother's Day even after they grew up and moved away. They sent pictures of their own children with notes scrawled on the back. Wish you were here, Mom. I raised them right, I used to think with quiet pride. They know what family means. But children grow up. They go to college and find careers and fall in love with people who become more important than the woman who taught them to tie their shoes. It's natural, expected, the way life is supposed to work. I knew that. I understood it intellectually. What I didn't understand was how lonely it would feel. Richard and I entered our empty nest years with grace, or so I thought. We took up dancing, ballroom dancing at the community center every Thursday night. We traveled a little, weekend trips to places we'd always talked about visiting. We rediscovered each other without the constant interruption of children's needs, and for a while, it felt like a second honeymoon. Then Richard got sick. It started small, a cough that wouldn't go away, fatigue that seemed to deepen every day. By the time we caught it, the cancer had already spread. Pancreatic cancer, the doctor said with the kind of gentle voice medical professionals use when they're delivering a death sentence. 6 months, maybe 8 if we were lucky. We weren't lucky. Richard died on a Tuesday morning in March, holding my hand and whispering that he loved me. The last thing he said was, "Take care of yourself, Ellie. Promise me you'll take care of yourself." I promised, but I had no idea what that would mean or how impossible it would become. The first year after Richard's death was a blur of grief and well-meaning visitors. Sarah drove down from Cleveland every few weeks to check on me. Michael called every Sunday from Phoenix. Jennifer sent cards with inspirational quotes and promises to visit soon from her home in California. Everyone was busy, everyone had their own lives, but they were present in the way adult children are present. Checking in, making sure I was still breathing, offering help I was too proud to accept. "Mom, you don't have to do everything yourself," Sarah would say, watching me struggle to change a light bulb or fix a leaky faucet. "Just call me. I can drive down on weekends." But I could hear the stress in her voice. Sarah had 2 teenagers and a demanding job as a school principal. Her marriage was going through a rough patch, something she tried to hide but couldn't quite manage. The last thing she needed was another person depending on her. So I learned to do things myself. I figured out how to change furnace filters and unclog drains. I taught myself to balance a checkbook and file taxes. I discovered that I was stronger than I'd ever known, more capable than a lifetime of being cared for had suggested. There was something empowering about it, something that made me feel like I was honoring Richard's memory by proving I could survive without him. But survival and living are different things, and slowly, quietly I began to understand the difference. The house felt enormous without Richard's presence to fill it. I started sleeping in the guest bedroom because our bed felt too big, too empty, too full of his absence. I stopped cooking real meals because making dinner for one felt pathetic. I ate cereal for dinner and told myself it was fine, it was practical, it was nobody's business but my own. The children called, but less frequently. Visits became monthly instead of weekly, then every few months, then only on holidays. It wasn't intentional, I told myself. They were busy. They had their own families, their own problems, their own lives to live. This was normal. This was what growing old meant. But normal doesn't make it hurt less. The second year was harder. I fell in the bathroom one night and lay there for 3 hours before I could get up, terrified and embarrassed and suddenly aware of how alone I really was. I didn't tell the children about the fall. I told myself it was because I didn't want to worry them, but the truth was I couldn't bear to see the look in their eyes, that mixture of concern and calculation, love and burden. Because that's what I was becoming, wasn't I? A burden. The signs were subtle at first. Sarah would call and sound slightly out of breath, like she was squeezing our conversation into her schedule between more important things. Michael's calls became shorter, more perfunctory. "How are you feeling, Mom?" "Good. Great. Listen, I've got to run, but I'll call you next week." Jennifer's cards still came, but less frequently, and they started to feel more like obligation than affection. I began to notice things during their visits. How they looked around the house with critical eyes, commenting on the peeling paint in the kitchen or the way the front steps were starting to sag. How they whispered in the hallway when they thought I couldn't hear, their voices carrying that particular tone adults use when they're making decisions about someone else's life. "She's getting forgetful," I heard Sarah tell Michael during one visit. "Last week she couldn't remember where she put her car keys. And look at this house, it's falling apart around her." I stood in the kitchen pretending to make tea, listening to my children discuss me like I was a problem to be solved. The car keys had been in my purse the whole time, exactly where they were supposed to be. I'd been looking for my reading glasses. But somehow, in the translation from mother to burden, every small human mistake became evidence of decline. "Maybe we should start looking into options," Michael said, and my heart clenched like a fist. Options. Such a clean, clinical word for the end of independence. The conversations became more frequent, more pointed. During family dinners, they'd steer the discussion toward my health, my safety, the practical difficulties of living alone in a house that was too big for me. They talked about me in the third person even when I was sitting right there, as if I'd already become invisible. "Mom's neighborhood isn't what it used to be," Jennifer would say, though our street was the same quiet residential area it had always been. "And that house is just too much for one person to maintain." They meant well. I knew they meant well. But meaning well and doing well are different things, and slowly, systematically, they began to dismantle my life with good intentions. First, they convinced me to stop driving. "It's not safe," Sarah said after I got confused in the grocery store parking lot one afternoon and took a few extra minutes to find my car. "What if you hurt someone? What if you hurt yourself?" The logical part of my brain knew she was right, but losing my car felt like losing my last connection to the wider world. Then they started helping with my finances. Michael flew in from Phoenix with a briefcase full of papers for me to sign, power of attorney documents that would let them make decisions on my behalf. "Just in case something happens," he explained, his voice gentle but firm. "Just so we can take care of things if you get sick." I signed the papers because I trusted them. Because they were my children, and despite everything I believed they loved me. I believed they wanted what was best for me. How naive I was. The final blow came on a rainy Thursday in October. I was sitting in my living room working on a crossword puzzle and listening to the radio when I heard cars in the driveway. Multiple cars. I looked out the window to see Sarah's Honda, Michael's rental car, and a white van I didn't recognize. My heart started beating faster, though I couldn't quite explain why. Something about the coordinated timing, the way they all arrived together, felt ominous. Sarah came in first, her smile too bright, her movements too carefully controlled. "Hi, Mom. How are you feeling today?" "Fine," I said, though I wasn't. I felt anxious, unsettled, like a storm was approaching and I was the only one who couldn't see it coming. Michael and Jennifer followed, and behind them came two people I'd never seen before. A woman in scrubs and a man in a suit carrying a clipboard. "Mom," Sarah said, sitting down beside me and taking my hands in hers. "We need to talk." The woman in scrubs introduced herself as a care coordinator from Willowbrook Nursing Home. The man was a social worker. They spoke in gentle, professional voices about levels of care and safety concerns, and the best possible environment for someone in my situation. My situation. As if being 78 and widowed was a medical condition that required institutional intervention. "We found you a lovely place," Jennifer said, her voice bright and false. "Willowbrook has an excellent reputation. They have activities and social opportunities, and the medical staff is available 24 hours a day." I looked around at my children. My babies, the people I'd loved more than my own life, and realized they'd already made their decision. The papers were signed. The room was reserved. The van was here to take my belongings. When? I asked, though my voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. Today, Michael said quietly. We thought it would be easier to just do it quickly. Like removing a band-aid. Like removing a band-aid. As if 78 years of life could be peeled away with one quick painful motion. I wanted to fight. I wanted to scream, to argue, to remind them of every sacrifice I'd made, every night I'd stayed up when they were sick, every time I'd put their needs before my own. I wanted to ask them how they could do this to me, how they could betray the trust of someone who'd given them everything. But I didn't. Because even in that moment, even as my world was crumbling around me, I still loved them. And I couldn't bear to make them feel guilty for something they obviously believed was right. So I packed my suitcase with hands that shook like autumn leaves, choosing which pieces of my life were small enough to fit in one bag. I left behind photo albums and china sets and the wedding dress I'd planned to give to Jennifer someday. I left behind the garden Richard and I had planted together, the kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals, the bedroom where I'd dreamed of growing old gracefully in the home we'd built together. I left behind everything that made me who I was. The ride to Willowbrook was silent except for Sarah's nervous chatter about the amenities and activities. She held my hand in the back seat, squeezing too tight, talking too fast, trying to convince both of us that this was a good thing, a positive change, an opportunity for me to make new friends and have new experiences. You're going to love it, Mom, she kept saying. You're going to be so much happier there. But I could see the tears in her eyes even as she smiled. I could hear the guilt in her voice, even as she tried to sound enthusiastic. They knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew it, and they were doing it anyway because it was easier than the alternative. Because taking care of me would have required sacrifice, and sacrifice was something they were no longer willing to make. We pulled into the parking lot of Willowbrook just as the sun was setting, painting the sky the color of old bruises. The building looked institutional despite the cheerful paint job and carefully landscaped gardens. It looked like exactly what it was, a place where people went to wait for death. Sarah walked me to the front desk, her arm around my shoulders, still talking in that bright, false voice. Here we are. Isn't this nice? Look at those beautiful flowers in the lobby. The flowers were silk. Meant to look cheerful and alive without requiring any actual care or attention. How fitting, I thought. The intake process was efficient and humiliating. Forms to fill out, medical histories to recite, personal belongings to be inventoried and stored. They gave me a plastic bracelet with my name and room number, like I was a package being delivered to the correct address. My room was small but clean, with a single bed, a dresser, and a chair by the window. The window looked out onto the parking lot, not the garden. I watched Sarah arrange my few possessions while Michael and Jennifer stood awkwardly by the door, checking their phones and glancing at their watches. Well, Sarah said finally, straightening my pillow for the third time. I think you're all set here. They hugged me goodbye, quick, guilty hugs that felt more like apologies than affection. They promised to visit soon, to call every day to make sure I was comfortable and happy. But I could see the relief in their eyes as they walked away. Relief that the problem of me had been solved, that they could go back to their busy, important lives without the constant worry of an aging mother who might need something they weren't prepared to give. I stood at my window and watched them drive away, their taillights disappearing into the darkness like dying stars. And for the first time since Richard's death, I felt truly, completely alone. The first month at Willowbrook passed in a haze of adjustment and resignation. I went to the activities they scheduled. Bingo on Tuesdays, arts and crafts on Thursdays, movie nights on Saturdays. I ate the meals they served at the assigned times. I took the medications they dispensed in little paper cups. I became compliant, invisible, just another old woman marking time until the inevitable. The other residents were kind enough, though many were too far gone with dementia or illness to form real connections. There was Margaret, who spent her days searching for her husband who'd been dead for 15 years. There was Frank, who told the same stories about the war over and over, his memories stuck on repeat. There was Betty, who rarely spoke but smiled sweetly when you sat beside her. We were all lost in our own ways, all abandoned by the people we'd raised and loved and sacrificed for. But we were polite about it. We didn't talk about the children who never called or the grandchildren who never visited. We pretended this was normal, acceptable, the natural order of things. The staff was professional but detached. They called me honey, and sweetie, in voices reserved for children and the elderly, those diminutive endearments that strip away dignity along with independence. They were kind but busy, caring but clinical. I was a patient, not a person. A problem to be managed, not a human being with feelings and memories and a lifetime of experiences. My children called occasionally, dutiful check-ins that lasted exactly long enough to assuage their guilt but not long enough to be inconvenient. "How are you doing, Mom?" "Good. That's great. The place is nice, right? I knew you'd adjust." They never asked if I was happy. They never asked if I missed my home. They never asked if I felt abandoned, betrayed, forgotten. Because they didn't want to know the answers to those questions. Sarah visited once in the first month, bringing flowers from the grocery store and staying for exactly 45 minutes. She complimented my room, praised the staff, and told me how good I looked. But she couldn't quite meet my eyes, and she kept checking her phone like she was expecting an urgent call that would give her an excuse to leave. "The kids are doing great," she said, showing me pictures on her phone. "Emma made honor roll and Jake just got his driver's license. They ask about you all the time. But they didn't ask to visit. They didn't ask for my phone number. They didn't even know where I was living now because Sarah had told them I'd moved to a nice place closer to town. As if I'd had a choice. As if this were some wonderful adventure instead of exile. Michael sent a card for my 79th birthday. A generic thinking of you card with a $20 bill inside and a note saying he hoped I was settling in well. Jennifer called that evening, chattering about her new job and her daughter's soccer team, mentioning my birthday only at the end of the conversation, almost as an afterthought. "Happy birthday, Mom. Sorry I couldn't be there. I hope you had a nice day." I'd spent my birthday eating cake with strangers and pretending to enjoy a rendition of Happy Birthday, sung by people who didn't know my name 3 months ago. I'd blown out candles on a sheet cake from the grocery store and made a wish I knew would never come true, to go home. But it was the evening of November 15th when everything finally broke apart inside me. I was sitting in the common room, half watching a game show on television, when one of the newer residents started crying. She was younger than most of us, maybe in her early 70s, and she'd been brought in the week before by her son and daughter-in-law. Her name was Rose, and she still had that shell-shocked look that all of us had worn in those first weeks. "I just want to call my grandson," she kept saying to anyone who would listen. "It's his birthday today. I never missed his birthday before. I promised I'd always call him on his birthday." The staff member on duty, a tired-looking woman named Carol, tried to explain that phone calls had to be scheduled in advance, that there were rules about when residents could use the phone, that it was too late in the evening for non-emergency calls. But Rose couldn't understand the rules. She couldn't understand why loving someone, wanting to honor a promise to a grandchild, wasn't considered an emergency. She just kept crying and asking to call, her voice getting more desperate with each request. And something inside me snapped. Maybe it was seeing my own abandonment reflected in Rose's tears. Maybe it was the casual cruelty of rules designed for convenience rather than compassion. Maybe it was the accumulation of months of being treated like a problem instead of a person. Or maybe it was the realization that this was my life now. That I would spend whatever years I had left begging for permission to love the people who'd stopped loving me back. "Let her call," I said, standing up from my chair. My voice was quiet, but something in my tone made the room go silent. Carol looked at me with surprise. In the 6 weeks I'd been there, I'd never caused trouble, never complained, never challenged their authority. I'd been the perfect patient. "Mrs. Henderson," Carol said in that patronizing voice they all used. "You know the rules about phone calls. She can call her grandson tomorrow during approved hours." "It's his birthday today," I said, walking toward them. "Not tomorrow. Today. And she's not asking for much. She's asking to tell a little boy that his grandmother loves him." Other residents were looking now, sensing drama in a place where drama was usually medicated away. Frank had stopped telling his war stories. Margaret had stopped searching for her long-dead husband. Even Betty was paying attention. "I understand this is emotional," Carol said, her professional training kicking in. "But we have procedures for a reason. If we start making exceptions..." "Exceptions for what?" I interrupted, and I could hear my voice getting stronger, louder, more like the woman I used to be before they convinced me I was too old to have opinions. "Exceptions for love. Exceptions for basic human decency. Exceptions for treating people like they still matter." Carol's supervisor appeared, drawn by the commotion. Her name was Linda, and she was the kind of administrator who saw residents as problems to be managed rather than people to be cared for. She took one look at the situation and immediately moved to shut it down. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm going to need you to return to your room," she said in a voice that brooked no argument. "Mrs. Peterson can make her phone call tomorrow during regular hours." But something was happening inside me, something I hadn't felt in months. I felt angry. Not sad, not resigned, not compliant. Angry. And anger, I realized, felt like coming back to life. "No," I said. Such a small word. 2 letters. 1 syllable. But it contained everything I'd been unable to say for months. "No, I won't be quiet. No, I won't be convenient. No, I won't pretend this is acceptable." "Excuse me." Linda's eyebrows shot up like I'd spoken in a foreign language. I said no. I looked around the room at all the other residents, these forgotten people who'd been convinced they had no choice but to accept whatever scraps of dignity we were offered. "Rose is going to call her grandson. Today. On his birthday. Because that's what grandmothers do. That's what love means." Linda's face was getting red. "Mrs. Henderson, if you continue to be disruptive, we'll have to discuss whether Willowbrook is the right fit for your needs." And there was the threat that hung over all of us, the fear they used to keep us compliant. "Be good, be quiet, be grateful, or we'll send you somewhere worse." Because there was always somewhere worse and we all knew it. But suddenly I didn't care. "Fine," I said, and I could hear the steel in my voice, the backbone I'd inherited from my mother and thought I'd lost somewhere along the way. "Discuss it. But first, Rose is going to call her grandson." The room was electric now. I could feel the other residents sitting up straighter, paying attention, remembering what it felt like to have someone fight for them. When was the last time anyone had fought for them? Linda and Carol exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to handle a resident who'd suddenly decided to stop being a victim. They were used to dealing with the confused, the compliant, the defeated. They weren't prepared for an old woman who'd remembered she used to be formidable. 5 minutes, Linda said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. 5 minutes, and then I want you in my office first thing tomorrow morning. Rose made her call. 5 minutes of pure joy as she wished her grandson happy birthday, told him she loved him, listened to him chatter about his party and his presents and his friends. 5 minutes of connection, of purpose, of being a grandmother instead of just another old woman taking up space. When she hung up, she was crying again. But these were different tears. These were tears of gratitude, of relief, of love acknowledged and received. And as I watched her, something shifted inside me permanently. I remembered who I used to be before they convinced me I was nobody. I remembered what it felt like to fight for the people I loved, to stand up for what was right, to refuse to accept unacceptable treatment. I remembered that I still had choices even here. The meeting in Linda's office the next morning went exactly as I expected. Threats disguised as concern, warnings wrapped in clinical language, subtle reminders that I was completely dependent on their goodwill for even the basic necessities of life. Your behavior yesterday was concerning, Linda said, reviewing my file like I was a case study rather than a human being. Willowbrook prides itself on maintaining a peaceful, orderly environment. Residents who can't adapt to our community standards may need to consider alternative arrangements. I sat in the uncomfortable chair across from her desk and listened to her recite the rules I'd supposedly broken, the policies I'd violated, the disruption I'd caused to their efficient operation. And I realized something profound. I wasn't afraid anymore. For months, I'd been terrified of making waves, of being seen as difficult, of giving them any excuse to send me away. But where would they send me? Somewhere worse. Somewhere that treated me with even less dignity, even less respect? What did I have to lose? I understand, I said when she finished her lecture. And I want you to understand something too. My name is Eleanor Henderson. I've been alive for 79 years. I raised 3 children, buried a husband, survived the Great Depression and World War II and the Kennedy assassination and 9/11. I've seen more of life than you've had time to experience, and I've learned something important along the way. Linda's pen stopped moving across her notepad. I've learned that there's a difference between being old and being invisible. There's a difference between being dependent and being worthless. And there's a difference between needing care and deserving to be stripped of every shred of dignity and autonomy. I could see her getting ready to interrupt, to shut down this unexpected display of backbone, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. Yesterday, A woman needed to call her grandson on his birthday. It was a simple request, a basic human need, and you turned it into a bureaucratic nightmare because it was inconvenient for you. That's not care. That's control. And I won't be controlled anymore. The silence stretched between us like a challenge. Linda was clearly calculating her options, weighing the trouble of dealing with a difficult resident against the trouble of explaining to my children why their mother was being transferred to another facility. What exactly are you saying, Mrs. Henderson? I'm saying that things are going to change. Not just for me but for everyone here. We may be old, we may be forgotten by our families, but we're still human beings. We still deserve to be treated with respect. And if we can't accommodate your expectations? I smiled then, really smiled for the first time in months. Then you'll have to explain to my children why their perfectly compliant mother suddenly became a problem. You'll have to document why a woman who never caused trouble for 6 weeks suddenly needs to be transferred. And you'll have to do it publicly because I intend to make this very public indeed. The truth was, I had very little power in that moment. I was still a resident in their facility, still dependent on their care, still essentially trapped by circumstances beyond my control. But I had one thing they hadn't counted on. I had nothing left to lose. Over the following weeks I became a different person. Not difficult, not aggressive, but quietly revolutionary. I started paying attention to the other residents in a way I hadn't before, really listening to their stories, their complaints, their unmet needs. There was Harold, whose family had promised to visit but hadn't been seen in 3 months. There was Dorothy, whose medications made her so drowsy she slept through most of the day. There was William, who'd been a carpenter for 50 years and begged for something to do with his hands besides watch television. I started organizing. Not protests or confrontations but small acts of rebellion that reminded everyone, staff and residents alike, that we were people, not inventory. I convinced the activities director to let Harold call his son during his lunch break. I spoke to the nursing supervisor about Dorothy's medication schedule. I found scrap wood and basic tools for William to carve with, reminding him that his skills still had value. Word spread the way it does in close communities. Other residents started coming to me with their own problems, their own needs that had been dismissed as inconvenient or unrealistic. And slowly, quietly, we began to remember what it felt like to advocate for ourselves. The staff's response was mixed. Some of them, particularly the younger caregivers, seemed relieved to see residents taking an active interest in their own lives. But the administration was less enthusiastic about what they saw as troublemaking. That's when I made my phone call. I'd been at Willowbrook for 3 months when I finally worked up the courage to contact the local newspaper. The reporter who answered was young and initially skeptical. What could an elderly nursing home resident possibly have to say that would interest their readers? But I was persistent. I told her about Rose and her grandson's birthday. I told her about Harold's family who'd stopped visiting and Dorothy's medication fog and William's unused skills. I told her about the silk flowers in the lobby and the rules that prioritized convenience over compassion. This isn't about one facility, I explained during our phone interview. This is about how we treat aging in this country. This is about what happens when love comes with an expiration date. The article was published on a Thursday morning in February. Forgotten Voices. Life Inside Willowbrook Nursing Home was the headline, and below it was my photograph. Not the defeated, diminished woman who'd arrived 6 months earlier, but someone who looked alert, engaged, alive. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Phone calls from other families dealing with similar situations. Letters from former nursing home employees who'd left the industry because they couldn't handle the way residents were treated. Messages from people who'd read the article and felt compelled to visit their own aging relatives. But the most important response came from my children. Sarah arrived first, driving down from Cleveland with a mixture of anxiety and anger that I'd recognized from her teenage years. She was furious that I'd spoken to the press, embarrassed that our family's business was now public, worried about the implications for her own reputation. "How could you do this, Mom?" she demanded, pacing around my small room like a caged animal. "How could you embarrass us like this? We did what we thought was best for you." I looked at my eldest daughter, this woman I'd raised, this person I'd loved more than my own life, and saw a stranger. Someone who cared more about appearances than truth, more about convenience than compassion. "Did you?" I asked quietly. "Did you really think this was best for me? Or did you think it was easiest for you?" The question hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we could cross. Michael flew in from Phoenix the next day, bringing Jennifer with him from California. The three of them sat in my room like a tribunal, united in their disapproval of my newfound voice. "We need to discuss your future," Michael said in his businessman voice, the tone he used when he was trying to take control of a situation. "Clearly Willowbrook isn't working out." "You're right," I said, and I saw relief flicker across their faces. "It's not working out. None of this is working out." I looked at each of them in turn. These people I'd birthed and raised and loved unconditionally for decades. These people who'd decided I was too inconvenient to keep in their lives but too guilty to completely abandon. "I want to go home," I said simply. The arguments came fast and familiar. I was too old to live alone. The house was too big, too much responsibility. What if I fell? What if I got sick? What if? But I'd had months to think about this, months to plan for this moment. "Then help me," I said. "Don't abandon me. Help me." It was Sarah who finally broke. The tears came all at once, months of guilt and grief and suppressed love pouring out in ugly, honest sobs. "I was so scared, Mom," she whispered. "I was so scared something would happen to you and I wouldn't be there and it would be my fault. I thought this was safer. I thought this was better." And there was the truth beneath all the practical arguments and careful justifications. They'd put me here not because they didn't love me, but because they loved me and didn't know how to handle the responsibility that came with that love. "I'm scared too," I admitted. "I'm scared of getting older, of becoming more dependent, of being a burden. But I'm more scared of disappearing. I'm more scared of becoming invisible." The conversation that followed was the most honest we'd had in years. We talked about fear and guilt and the impossible expectations we'd placed on each other. We talked about love and responsibility and what it really means to take care of someone. Most importantly, we talked about choice. My choice to accept help when I needed it. Their choice to provide support without taking over my life completely. It took 2 months to arrange, but in April, 1 year after Richard's death, 9 months after my exile to Willowbrook, I moved back home. Not alone but not imprisoned either. Sarah hired a companion to check on me 3 times a week. Michael set up a medical alert system. Jennifer arranged for grocery delivery and a cleaning service. They visit more often now. Real visits, not duty calls. We cook dinner together in my kitchen and they tell me about their lives, their problems, their dreams. We look through photo albums and remember better times. We plan for the future, acknowledging that my future is probably shorter than theirs but insisting that it's still worth planning for. I'm 80 years old now and I know this arrangement won't last forever. There may come a time when I need more care than can be provided at home. But if that time comes, it will be a decision we make together based on my needs rather than their convenience. The article I wrote led to others. I've become something of an advocate for nursing home reform, speaking to families about alternatives to institutional care, working with legislators on policies that prioritize dignity along with safety. Most importantly, I've learned that growing old doesn't mean becoming powerless. It doesn't mean accepting whatever treatment others decide is appropriate. It doesn't mean disappearing into the background of other people's lives. I may be old, but I'm still here. I'm still Eleanor Henderson. I still matter. And I will not be forgotten. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking this road with me. I hope this story gave you strength, or at least the feeling that you're not alone. Comment where you're watching from and maybe subscribe. Let's build a place where voices like mine, and maybe even yours, are finally heard.